Welcome back to another episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be flipping through some of the top stories, including how Americans' foreign policy may actually lead to another draft, or even our military policy in general. An interesting article talking about Taiwan and some of the provocative stances that its president is taking. And our final article is talking about how a bakery has actually predicted the presidential election for the last 40 plus years. And of course, we went today with our Daily Delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive, ready to take on the day. But that's enough rambling from me. Let's jump into our daily debate. So, going forward, if you are of my generation, and this is not trying to exclude anybody else, but it's going to apply to our generation more than likely, if it was to happen at all, is there going to be a draft? And if there was a draft, what would you do? I'm curious, because I know lots of people who say they would try to skip the draft. I know lots of people who say that they would take up arms and fight, and I have plenty of people who say they are going straight to Canada. So I want to know what everybody else's opinion is, because I feel like our generation in general is very anti-war, but maybe the sentiment is only the people I interact with. Maybe there are people out there who disagree and would be more than willing and ready to serve their country. But with that said, let's actually jump into our first article that comes from the American Conservative. America's failed grand strategy guarantees the draft's return. So this is a critical think piece that not only lambasts the American military and national security strategy, but also comes after some of our decisions on a grand scale, which obviously are encompassed in both of those topics, but it outlines how we have made some mistakes recently that are going to basically guarantee that we are going to have a draft if a military conflict is to come. So let's jump into the first article's second paragraph. Quote, America's efforts to wage a proxy war in Ukraine are meeting with slow but grinding failure that has depleted our stockpiles and given Russia plenty of experience defeating numerous American weapon systems ranging from Abrams tanks to Excalibur precision artillery rounds. So, criticism number one, while we are trying to provide aid to other locations, while we are attempting to ensure that democracy flourishes in Ukraine, or even trying to restock some of the weapon systems in Israel, we are actually giving our enemy plenty of opportunity to learn how to actively combat what we would throw at them. This is obviously fair. Then again, the argument could come in that a lot of the systems that we're giving to these different countries, a lot of the different munitions and other military-grade weapons that we're giving are normally out of date, or at least a little bit older, and we have to resupply them, we have to restock, we have to rebuild them. So we're actually doing ourselves, quote-unquote, a service by giving these away and ensuring that we have the newest, latest stuff. Fair enough, interesting argument. There's no doubt about that in my mind. But that doesn't mean that if they're built on the same infrastructure, that if they are using the same kinds of technology, or at least similar kinds of technology when we're rebuilding those new systems, that Russia has much more experience fighting them. And in general, if we are waging proxy wars against our enemies, and let's say that this is actually what it is. Most people would probably agree to some degree that this is a proxy war, considering NATO is funding so much of it against Russia in Ukraine. And you could even make the same argument for Israel versus Iran, depending on what perspective you come from. But the point being, whether they're official proxy wars or not, we are definitely giving these different countries lots of experience. When was the last time that the United States fought a proper war? Last ground war that we were doing a full invasion force, essentially. Then again, you can make arguments about Desert Storm. You could even make arguments about our incursions into Iraq and Afghanistan, which were full-on wars, at least in the scope of death and destruction. But what about where a majority of the fighting force was United States soldiers, and they were going up directly against one of our enemies rather than a proxy? Because in Vietnam, it was basically a proxy for the Russians, even though you could make a solid argument that it was the Vietnamese in North Korea. So my point being that how well trained are we? And let's be clear, greatest military on earth. We have achieved a lot. We have also lost a lot recently. And have we had direct battle experience, especially defending our own nation like Russia has now? Or maybe, then again, Iran, not necessarily as much, but specifically Russia, they definitely have a lot of on-the-ground training that we don't necessarily have nowadays if we were to go to a direct war with Russia. Then again, very rare, probably not going to happen because of the threat of nuclear weapons. But the point being that we are definitely supplying them with lots of training information. Instead of running a whole bunch of simulations as to how military tactics will go, they get to see real-life military tactics and real-life weapons that we have provided, used, and the strategic objectives that are best suited for those weapons. And what do I mean by that? So if we have a very particular type of technology which is capable of doing, let's just say, XYZ damage for the sake of argument, it doesn't have to be anything specific, but we have technology that is very capable of being used for, let's say, bunker busting. And if that is missile T, and the Russians are able to identify its flight pattern, the amount of burn that the fuel uses, where we normally set up our different turrets or arm systems in order to send them across the border into different locations to bust bunkers, they are gaining real-time information on how we actually use said things. So then in the future, if they see those same exact turrets, if they see them being used in a similar way, then guess what? They have more information. They have real-life data as to how these technologies have been used, how they've been used against them, and how they can effectively down some of those missiles in that case, or even counteract some of the things like Abrams tanks that we have been providing for them. Maybe the shell on the Abrams tanks, the armoring on the Abrams tanks does not handle the certain caliber of shell very well. And then Russia knows this, so they know, okay, hey, in the case of using this against Abrams tanks, we need to have XYZ shells. We need to have an extra surplus of them. So it actually allows them to effectively use their resources to create countermeasures rather than having to make a large selection of different countermeasures and not necessarily know which one is which. But these are all, that's a very select example of actually giving basically our enemies training data. How else does it come down to us needing to be drafted, how we might actually have to be drafted in order to successfully implement some of the plans that the military is putting into place? So there's a great example that this author brings up. Quote, one perfect example is the Navy's plan to expand the battle force fleet to 381 vessels, up from around 295 currently. Yet the Navy is also currently discussing plans to mothball 17 support ships because there are not enough sailors to crew them. If we can't man the Navy now at its current size, how will we do so with nearly 100 more ships? So expanding our military capabilities, expanding the amount of ships that we have, expanding the amount of tanks that we have, expanding the amount of aircraft we have, these are normally justifications for more military spending. But if we're actually seeing the numbers of military applicants and people who are willing to actually serve and go in and become very specialized and do the years of training on how to properly operate some of this machinery, if they're not showing up to the registrar, if they're not going to these different military offices and saying, I want to be a part of this movement, I want to defend my nation's freedom, then all this extra expansion that we're doing and all these extra vehicles and different technologies that we're starting to build out and building a larger supply of, how is that actually going to be useful if we don't have the people to actually use them? So that leads to the question. Either one, we scale down what we're making and we make what we're making more effective. So say that you have a tank that only needs to be operated by 2 people rather than 4 people. And let's make it an ideal world where you can have a tank fully operated by just 1 person. And you have a whole bunch of intelligent weapon systems that are able to operate without necessarily input from somebody else. That would be improving the quality of our machinery without necessarily having to increase the quantity of people that we bring in order to operate said machinery. So that's one way forward. That will also be more expensive. Or another way forward in this situation where we are overbuilding, we are creating too many different vehicles, different systems, different technologies that can't be utilized without more people. The answer to actually utilize them properly is, okay, we need to get in those more people. We need to draft them. It's an interesting argument for sure. And I thought that example really, really elucidated what the author was going for here, which is if we want to have the military expansion in order to properly take on our enemies and also show that we are a potential threat. Not that we want to go to war with anybody, but in theory, you want to appear as big as possible. You want to be a peacock puffing his chest saying, yeah, come at me kind of deal. In order to reach that place, we're going to have more people that we draft. Remember, China, when you look at them, they have a population of nearly 1 billion. If you take half of their population and put them into the military, that is still more than the entire population of the United States, and we don't even have 1/10 of our population in the army. And I'm not saying that China has half of their people in the army. What I'm saying is if they were to do a draft and they were to say, okay, roughly half the population is male, and we don't want to necessarily risk females, but maybe they do risk females, then you could still say that maybe even 45% of their population would be of relative fighting age in desperate times, even though they are having a aging crisis. There's no doubt about that. But say that you even move the cap to like 40, 45 years old, then you could still roughly work out maybe 40% of the population of China could be viable for the draft. If you look at the numbers for the United States, it's probably within those same parameters, so above the age of 18, below the age of 45, we're still probably looking at maybe 30% of the population. And remember, it's 40% of 1 billion versus 30% of 328, I believe. Last time I checked, it could actually be north of that now. So in order to implement some of these changes and actually be the most effective force and actually utilize all this extra military spending that is going into these different programs, we're probably going to have to draft people. In order to appear as the peacock with its chest puffed, we're going to have higher recruitment numbers. And the author goes on to say it's not necessarily just about whether or not we actually are capable of manning all of these things, but also, are people willing to actually go into this service? Is this service being taken seriously nowadays? Are we recruiting the best, or are we recruiting the half best? Are we actually putting in policies that are going to ensure that we have people worthy of operating all of these things or not? And the author makes a very interesting point that no, we're not actually. Quote, the author points out that the individual ready reserve, which is composed of former service personnel who do not actively train and drill, but may be called back into active service in the event that they are needed, currently stands at roughly 76,000 troops, down from over 700,000 in 1973, all of whom would be needed within a month or so of the start of a conflict. And it is not surprising then the author states that there may be a need to reinstate conscription, stating large-scale combat operation troops requirements may well require a reconceptualization of the 1970s and 1980s volunteer force and move towards partial conscription. So he's criticizing that we don't have enough people actively participating in the military. We don't have enough people who could be called into service, and then rightly points out that we may have to conscript a volunteer force, so to speak, which means we're not pulling from the best. We're not getting the cream of the crop. We are just pulling from the average population. And I think that when I sit back and I say, is my generation one that will get drafted? The question was bouncing around my mind before this even happened. It was bouncing around my mind before Ukraine even happened. It was a joke that I made with my friends when I was 19 years old with how I saw personally the China situation going. I said, I think we might get drafted within our lifetime. People laughed me off, and I think people will still laugh off this commentary from this author and probably from me. But I do not see it as impossible. I see it as more than likely, especially when we have a system that is set up to ensure that one group, one industry, is going to continue to benefit from encouraging the United States to go to war. And the other party that won't benefit from it, the people whose lives will be lost, the U.S. citizens who will lose family members, who will lose their brothers, their sisters, their wives, their husbands, when they are the ones that have the barrel pointed at them and the government has the ability to say, oh, you are going to go fight for your country. I think it's something that we can't ignore, and it's a serious contention. Are you willing to die for your country? If you're willing to die for your country, maybe you don't care about the draft. And I battle with that all the time. I believe in the values of America, and I love what we stand for. Am I willing to die on the battlefield for it? It's a hard question. It's something that most people have to grapple with. And some people have to grapple with it when they're being forced to do it. So I would say at least think it over before it happens to you and you're not actually prepared for it. With that said, let's move on to our second article that comes from Business Insider. Taiwan's president is doubling down on sticking it to Beijing, saying China cannot be the motherland because its government is younger. For those of you who do not know, this is actually very inflammatory language coming from the president of Taiwan. So with that said, I want to jump into the first two paragraphs where it actually describes what the president said more specifically and outlines some of the context here as well. The Republic of China was founded around 1912 after the end of the Qing Dynasty. A little bit more, Qing Dynasty, a little bit more of an overthrow, realistically. And they were trying to unify China. There was a little bit of a revolt from Mao Zedong, probably heard about that figure. And the People's Republic of China was founded after that, after they were basically kicked off the mainland because they worked together for a little bit of World War II, and then after the fact, there was more kerfuffles, more scuffles after the party that was ran by Mao Zedong at that time was still trying to get them out of the country, essentially. They fled to Taiwan. And ever since then, they've been a government in exile, essentially. So what the president is saying here is that for 113 years, the actual Republic of China, not the People's Republic of China, the Republic of China has existed continuously as a government, and now they exist on Taiwan, claiming that their government is older than China's government, which the People's Republic of China is celebrating its 75th year on October 1st. And this is a big pain point for Xi Jinping, but also the Communist Chinese Party in general, because one, they don't acknowledge the legitimacy of Taiwan as a nation, but also because how to put it nicely, if you go and say, yes, the government that exists on Taiwan is legitimate, then even though it has its own manifestations nowadays, even though it has a different system, you are legitimizing their claim to being able to govern themselves, therefore legitimizing the fact that they are a actual government that it was in exile, aka the proper government of China, and therefore they have territorial claims over China. That would at least be the stretched thin logic of the People's Republic of China. They claim that any talk of secession, whether it be any support from outside nations claiming that Taiwan is independent or from Taiwan itself, is basically a provocation, and they want to take back Taiwan. Xi Jinping, for many years, has made multiple comments across many speeches that we are seriously considering trying to reunify with Taiwan. They've talked about trying to do it peacefully rather than having to do it violently. And they have also expanded their navy over the course of the last few years in order to possibly, increase their claim in the South China Sea, which they have the dotted line. It's complicated. They claim almost all of the South China Sea. They've started building artificial islands. But the whole point is that they could, in theory, blockade Taiwan. And since Taiwan is a major producer of semiconductors, as well as one of the largest thriving democracies within the region, the U.S. has been backing them up for a long time. Remember when Nancy Pelosi went there about a year and a half ago, and there was some air raids, and by air raids I mean China didn't actually bomb anything on Taiwan, but they did deploy airplanes, and Taiwan had to deploy defensive measures because the Chinese planes actually flew over Taiwanese airspace, so they had to respond and show that they're ready, because if Taiwan decides to sit back on its laurels one day and says, oh, no, these are just fake raids by the Chinese, these are just fake attempts in order to stir us and wear us down over time, then the Chinese will take it as a sign of weakness and therefore will consider invading even more. It'd be very hard. It would take an amphibious force in order to invade the island, and if the U.S. had anything to do with it, they would have battleships in the straits. Then again, China could actually very well win that, mainly because even if our ships are very strong, and even if we have our huge aircraft carriers in the region, the Chinese still have the mainland where they could fire missiles from, and these could be very well guided missiles. They could be tracking missiles. They could basically knock out most of the infrastructure that we would place in the South China Sea. So this is why it's hotly contentious, because it's really hard for China to actually take over Taiwan. It's hard for us to support Taiwan, and it's basically at the point where heads are butting extremely hard. There are multiple theories out there that the Chinese population is going into a demographic decline, and that if there is any time that they would actually be able to invade Taiwan and basically assimilate their population as well as their semiconductor production capabilities, that it would have to happen by like 2035 is the rough estimate. I made a bet that 2027 is when it's going to happen. I still have that money out there because obviously it hasn't happened yet, but I could still see it within the foreseeable future. And you may be thinking, okay, why does this matter? Because hot language, whether you like it or not, insults the ego of the Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party. And any signs of weakness within the nation or that are projected onto the nation from the outside, they warrant a response. Very often you see China in many of their public relations statements, they will not acknowledge that things happen. They will not acknowledge any issues because they want to make sure that they have a quote-unquote good face to the rest of the world. They want to make sure that there's not pie on their face, essentially, that they're not embarrassed. Pride is a huge, huge point of contention with the Communist Party of China. So if these sort of comments come out where he's basically saying that, oh, well, no, China is actually the younger of the governments and the Republic of China, aka Taiwan, is actually the older government, this is secessionist language in the eyes of most Chinese officials, if not some of them and enough of them to actually warrant a response. And why does this matter? Why, at the end of the day, am I putting this after a segment about the draft? Because this is the most likely, if there's anything that is going to devolve, this is the most likely one to do it, where we will actually get involved in the conflict ourselves. Mainly our Navy personnel, but it could very well be our Army personnel as well. Then again, we're not going to do a mainland invasion of China anytime soon, but still there could be some need for it on Taiwan, though I don't necessarily see that happening. I do see our Navy getting directly involved and possibly some of our Air Force as well. And this is because of two things. One, because of Thucydides' trap. China is on the economic side challenging us on the world stage. They are also trying to be the new world leader, so to speak. And as a nation that has been through a period of hegemony, we don't like, our egos are also at play here. Our pride is also at play. We don't like playing second fiddle on anybody. We like throwing our weight around on the international stage. We've gotten used to it. We're egotistical, just like Britain was in the early 1900s going into the 1950s. And maybe we'll have to re-examine that position. And anybody challenging us causes us to ask the question how we got to the point where we are, and that requires self-examination. And when you self-examine, you don't necessarily like what you hear. And also the establishment people, whether it be bureaucrats, whether it be the people who revolve through these even appointed positions, they have a certain way of thinking that has been developed over years upon years upon years, been passed down from the previous holders of their positions and previous bureaucrats. And to break that illusion, to change their perspective, to have an alternative point of view is not necessarily easy. So it puts us at odds with a rising power, and Also, Taiwan is one of the largest producers of the most advanced microchips, semiconductors, in the entire world. Our supply chains have relied on them for too long. There are different processes going on right now, whether it be like the CHIPS Act or other investment policies or tariff policies in order to limit China's ability to grow their infrastructure around making semiconductors, or trying to make sure, like with the CHIPS Act, that more semiconductor production is here. There are different techniques to mitigate the rise of China and to ensure the place of the United States. But as of right now, even TSMC, who has done partnerships with the US, they are still keeping some of the most treasured microchip technology to themselves, because Taiwan understands that it makes them valuable to not only the world economy, but also to the developed the developed nations who do not necessarily want to be in the stranglehold of China. South Korea is also making good progress on this as well. There are other countries that are rising to TSMC's levels, Samsung being a company that is doing so. But even then, most of Samsung stuff is more targeted towards smartphones, and that doesn't necessarily always translate to other things that we may use those semiconductors for, like cars nowadays. We use them a lot. So imagine China having control over this really critical infrastructure before we're able to actually port over all of the knowledge from Taiwan. And that is not something that we're looking forward to. That's not something that we want to deal with. That's not something that we can necessarily stand for. So that's why I feel as though we are running into a place where our ego, our pride, our willingness to be militarily engaged across the world, as well as our economic interests, are almost all aligned to actually be involved in something going on in Asia, especially Taiwan. And we want to set the course for the next decade, because remember, where is a lot of this development happening? Whether it be Indonesia, which is actually developing its mining industry, its lithium industry, some of its high-tech sectors as well, to places like India that's obviously coming along. Asia will be the next front of the global stage, and we want to make sure that we have a strong ally there. The Philippines have started to blow us off a little bit. We have one with Japan. They're starting to rearm. But right now, Taiwan is indeed one of those strong allies, and we want to make sure that we secure a good democratic future. If you're playing into the foreign policy establishment, oh, we need to project democracy around the world point of view, or even the realpolitik point of view, which is, if this is going to be the area of critical minerals, economic development, we want to be playing some sort of part in it. So all of these incentives align to possibly getting us into war. And as we outlined in the first one, are we necessarily prepared for war? Are our enemies able to understand some of our technology better? Do we have everybody that we need to properly man the ships that would need to be sent into these war zones? Not necessarily. So that's why I think there is a path towards a draft, and I don't want to be overly cynical about it, but I want to be realistic. There is a path to the draft. Wow, that rhymes. We just need to be realistic. All right, so that's enough on all the doom and gloom. We actually kind of have two fun articles today, because this next article is also a little bit of an enjoyable one. And it's because it's about a bakery in Cincinnati that has predicted the presidential election in the last, since 1984, I believe. Yes. So the headline comes from the New York Post, the Ohio bakery that's predicted every presidential election since 1984. And for those of you who don't care, you're like, oh, great, it's another Puppy Bowl thing, and the puppies didn't necessarily get it right. No, these guys are on point. The owner said, quote, "We're famous for predictions. Starting in 1982 with the Super Bowl cookie poll, we baked for each team. We then counted how many were sold. In 1984's Reagan and Mondale race, we did another poll. We've since correctly predicted just about every election." And that is interesting, great, cool. We love the history. What are they saying for this year? Buskin said, quote, "Tremendous lead. Sold so far, Trump cookies were 9,872. Harris, 3,131. End quote. And then no crumbs counted. For some independent nobody, a smile face, quote, crummy candidate grabbed 599. So basically what they're saying is the independent candidates have no chance whatsoever, and that Trump has a massive lead. Also remember how much of a red state Ohio is now versus in the past, when it could be considered a little bit of a flip state, a little bit of a, how should I say, battleground state. We'll use that terminology for everybody who's not necessarily familiar. So do I take it 100% that Trump's going to win? No, but it's just more data, and it's from an outside source, and it's not just polls. So I think it's fascinating. So take that as you will. But with all that, let's jump into our daily delight, which should, in theory, leave you with a smile on your face. So, Mo Dang, a thriller to an adorable moonwalk caught on viral video. It is also from the New York Post, and it is Mo Dang, the pygmy hippo that was actually doing a little bit of a backwards walk. Though he is a little contentious here, he's biting, he's nipping, he's being a little bit of a sassy boy. His moonwalk is most definitely a recovery, and everybody is absolutely fawning over him. There's no doubt about that. So if you want to check out that video or you want to read any of today's articles, there'll be a link in the description below that like and subscribe button to every single one of them. Also down there, you can find the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Cast, and Podvine. If you want to check out the Twitter tirade, it comes out on Tuesday and Thursday over at the Twitter handle at Your Daily Flip. It's a little bit off the top of the head, just random thoughts that I have that pop into this big fat forehead of mine. And if you want to check out the international news, it's 6 and 6 stories from around the world in 6 minutes or less. And that comes out on Tuesday and Thursday as well at the same YouTube channel, this same one, and that same RSS feed that I mentioned down there in the description. So with all that said, there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe, don't die.